We are Group 8, Section 502, and we are covering Kenya. For the agenda, what we'll be covering in this presentation, we will start with a historical overview, then we will move to a cultural overview, the macroeconomic and political stability, investments in health and education, effective governance and institutions, favorable environment for private enterprise, trade openness and growth, favorable geography, historical data, and economic policies. Then we will give a brief review of what we've covered and our citations. For the historical overview, Kenya was a British colony from the 19th century until 1922 when they declared independence and then spent the next 4 decades fighting for their freedom. They became officially independent in 1963. They are surrounded by countries in the midst of revolution or who have had rough histories, so Kenya has in turn faced many struggles themselves. Nairobi is the capital of Kenya. As of 2018, Kenya had a population of about 51.39 million people.
So a cultural overview of Kenya. Language, there are 2 official languages spoken in Kenya. It's English and Swahili, but there are 62 other languages that are also spoken in Kenya. A lot of those are different African tribal languages and even a few Middle Eastern languages from immigrants. In terms of religion, it's a very Christian country with predominantly Protestants. Also a good portion of them are Catholic, followed by Muslim, and then a lot of indigenous beliefs, again, being a lot of different tribal influences in Kenya. In terms of food, very staple grain country, most commonly is maize. There's a few other grains that are pretty popular across all Africa, including sorghum and millet. In terms of meals, those grains are usually paired with meat such as goat, beef, lamb, chicken, and other veggies. In terms of the macroeconomic and political stability, they had a big political reform back in 2010 where a new constitution was written. And it looks very similar in terms of structure to what the US has in place with a bicameral house, democratic elections, that sort of thing. This definitely helped engender some economic growth for the country, leading into the decade coming after 2010. Since then, they've been growing quite quickly, even in terms of a developing country. World Bank data shows that it was around 5.7% last year in 2019. Going forward, Kenya is one of the faster growing countries in not only sub-Saharan Africa, but in the continent as a whole. The sort of stable macroeconomic environment has been achieved through a very dynamic private sector, just meaning that they have a lot of different avenues of income, such as like tourism, trade, services, that sort of thing. Growing investor confidence and strong institutions, again, sort of mirroring the structure that's in place in the US and other Western countries. And as long as Kenya continues to tackle sort of like their own health problems, much like with that rest of Africa experiences, then they should continue to grow at an exceeding rate going forward.
Now I will discuss the level of investment in health and education within Kenya. First off, investment is crucial in order to trigger economic growth within a region, especially within the sectors of health and education. So in 2018, according to Health Metrics and Evaluation, Kenya was actually ranked number 1 in its region for investment in health and education. Areas within the region include Botswana, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. Since 1990, Kenya has actually seen a decrease in investment within education. However, the level of education among their citizens has increased. They have risen 16 places since 1990 in this regard. The number of years people are spending in school on average is also increasing, which is a sign of growth. Sadly, education quality is still rather poor within Kenya, as they are ranked 157th in the world right now, whereas in 1990 they were ranked 137th. So this is a pretty large drop. As for investment in health, over the last decade there has been a substantial increase. Kenya has seen noticeable improvements in their health infrastructure and equipment. So this involves easier access to vaccines, more training for healthcare professionals, and other forms of healthcare services. In Kenya, they provide universal health coverage, which has been a massive source of investment. Today, the government vows to continue their collaboration with partners both internationally and locally to keep increasing their investment and improving the level of healthcare that they provide their citizens with.
Alrighty, so my two slides were over the effective governance and institutions of Kenya and the favorable environment for private enterprise. So to start off with, the Kenya's economy has been primarily pretty effective in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, although they are not immune to a lot of the problems that plague other sub-Saharan African countries. When it comes to governance, a lot of what they do, a lot of their economy is hampered by corruption and sometimes an unstable national administration. For the latter part, for example, just 3 years ago, there was a presidential election between Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga, and that actually slowed GDP growth by several percentage points. And then, for example, regarding corruption, fraud is actually the #1 economic crime in the nation. The Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Kenya 139th out of 176 countries in the world for the least corrupt countries in 2012. So basically, #1 would be the least corrupt country, and this Kenya was actually pretty low on that scale. Bribery and fraud are estimated to cost the Kenyan economy up to $1 billion approximately in a year. In addition, the regulations that the government imposes when they do succeed in their intentions, they're often seen as inefficient. They're seen as cumbersome, and it does detract from economic growth. While all of that is true, there have been some policies that the government has been enacting recently to promote further growth, and they can be described as relatively effective. For example, programs like Kenya Vision 2030 and the Kenya Economic Stimulus Program have both shown promise in signaling a consistent plan for the future. So basically, the government, while it's not particularly efficient and it has been hampered by corruption, there have been developments in the past couple of years that have signaled a more favorable climate for economic growth in the future, and hopefully some of the corruption will be dealt with in the near future as well, to make sure that Kenya is a more prosperous nation for further growth. Excuse me. As for the favorable environment for private enterprise, so again, compared to the rest of the region, Kenya has been relatively open to foreign direct investment for the last half century, which has definitely worked to its advantage. For example, the infrastructure system in Kenya, like a lot of areas in sub-Saharan Africa, has been lackluster. It has not been up to the standards that would provide for a more favorable economic environment. That same attraction to foreign capital has helped new projects for improving that infrastructure, which of course will lead to further growth down the line and make it a more attractive area for development. The World Bank actually, they do a ranking of the ease of doing business index, and most recently Kenya's been placed 56th out of 190 countries, which, it's not amazing, but when you compare it to the rest of the sub-Saharan nations, that's actually near the top. It's actually second when it comes to that region. and it carries an easy designation. The top designation would be very easy, but they're in that second tier, and they've been doing pretty well for their region. And the aforementioned current president, Uhuru Kenyatta, he has made economic growth a key component of his administration. And again, like the policies that they were enacting beforehand that we mentioned, it's sending a signal to the world that investment and industry would find a promising home in Kenya.
Next, we'll look at trade openness and growth. The following data was provided by the World Bank to theglobalEconomy.com. First, we'll look at trade openness. Considering exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP, the latest value from 2018 for Kenya was 36.18%. For comparison, the world average in 2018, based on 161 countries, was 94.23%. To interpret this meaning, it shows that Kenya has relatively low trade openness compared to the rest of the world. Looking at the statistical graph covering Kenya's trade openness from 1960s until 2018, we can see Kenya has been trending down slowly over time. There are brief periods when trade openness increased. However, most of the data shows a decrease in openness over time. The lowest percentage during this time frame is actually in 2018, when the value was 36.18% of their total GDP. To look at growth for Kenya, we look at the annual growth of exports of goods and services. In 2018, the growth rate was 4.04%. For comparison, the world average based on 146 countries was 5.06%. This means Kenya has had relatively less growth on average than other countries around the world. To look at the statistical graph for Kenya's growth of exports, we can see there was a high point in 1993 when it reached its maximum value of 31.52%, and its lowest point in 1975 when it had a value of negative 11.62%. Growth over time has been at both extremes, with negative values and extremely high values. As stated before, Kenya currently has low growth compared to other countries around the world.
Next, I will explain Kenya's geography and any favorable features of it. So Kenya is located in East Africa along the Indian Ocean. As you can see, it is labeled in yellow on the map, right along the coast. When one thinks of Africa and its landscape, they usually picture more desert land, and this is exactly what Kenya consists of. They are mainly a low coastal terrain and savanna. However, towards the center of Kenya, we will see a few mountains and plateaus. The tallest mountain is Mount Kenya. The mountain is located north of Nairobi, which is their capital, and it sits at 17,058 feet high. It is known to be the second tallest mountain in Africa, right after Mount Kilimanjaro. So one major benefit of this mountain is that it provides fresh water to all the surrounding areas. There is also one fertile plateau in western Kenya, which is very good for food production for the region.
To continue, we can talk about historical data. Kenya's annual GDP currently sits at $88 billion USD according to the World Bank. However, in 1960, this was around $790 million. Population growth has been fairly linear between 1960 and now. It's grown from 8 million to 50 million people. Kenya gained independence in 1963, but as we know, the people were still there before then. The Mau Mau Revolution occurred in 1953, according to the BBC. This occurred due to the marginalization from British settlers. Over 90,000 Kenyan people were killed. In contrast, only about 32 white settlers were killed. GDP has also steadily grown and is currently at around $2,961 when calculated through purchasing power parity. GNI per capita similarly grew from $100 in 1960 to approximately $1,620 currently. Next, we can look at Human Capital Index, which is a report prepared by the World Bank. It measures how well a country is at mobilizing the economic and professional potential of its citizens. Essentially, it measures how much a child born today can expect to attain by the age of 18. Kenya's is currently at 0.52. In contrast, the highest HCI, which belongs to Singapore, is currently at 0.88.
To continue, Kenya also has quite a few economic policies in place to increase its economy. To begin with, we can talk about Kenyanization, which is a plan to replace non-citizens with citizens in key areas of the economy, according to USTR.gov. Kenya also aimed to include a mixed economy with both public and private support. Once gaining independence, the government focused on rapid economic growth. This was very important for the economic growth. Next, there was a lot of increased investment support for Kenyans. This is known as redistribution through growth. They presented the poor with investing resources and gave them permanent income without taking anything away from other parts of the community. In order to increase foreign investment, there were a lot of tax holidays and incentives in place. They offered tax incentives to both foreign and native investors. Next, we could talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area. In August 2019, the United States and the African Union signed a joint statement in concern with the development of the AFCFTA. It reflected their common goal to deepen trade and investment relationships across the continent. This did really well for Eastern Africa, which Kenya is a part of. They expected an increase of 2 million jobs and an increase in exports by over $1 billion. Kenya is placed to take advantage of these new opportunities. Next, we could talk about the U.S.-Kenya Trade and Investment Working Group. This explored ways to deepen the trade and investment ties between the USA and Kenya, and it laid the groundwork for stronger future trade relationships. They talked about pursuing exploratory talks on future bilateral trade, as well as maximizing the remaining years of African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as the AGOA. They also talked about strengthening commercial and cooperation, and developing short-term solutions to reduce barriers to trade and investment.
In conclusion, we can see that the nation of Kenya has been able to employ its innate advantages to propel itself to a faster level of growth than many other nations in the region. The political stability of Kenya, combined with its investments in health and education, also combined with the favorable economic climate with the attraction of foreign investment for further growth, often overcomes the corruption and ineffective governance that challenges the growth itself. This, again, has allowed Kenya to overcome many of the challenges that have faced other countries in the region, sub-Saharan Africa, and other nations in its bracket of similar resources. These are our works cited. And we hope that you've been able to learn a lot about Kenya today. Thank you.